All right. So yeah, welcome everyone, and especially I would like to thank the organizer, Shapnan, Joao, Alexander, Arjun, and Anna for this invitation. It's really a big honor for me to talk at your workshop, and yeah, be here virtually today. Unfortunately, I really wish I could be there, but unfortunately that's not possible. But still, I am happy that I'm able to be here even virtually today. So what I'm going to talk today about is a little bit different than perhaps the usual, talk that you might see. And when I was asked to give this keynote, I was thinking, oh yeah, this is stepping into big shoes even, because there were amazing keynotes before me. So what I decided to do is, in fact, a little bit of a mix of a talk. So this is going to be on some parts, an initial part where would like to give a few opinions or also reflections on what we call negative results. And in this part also relate back to some of these great keynotes that we have heard earlier at this workshop. And then I do still want to show you in the big last part, 3 examples on how we can turn something perceived as possible noise or failure into an opportunity. Because I think this is really often the case, that we can go further and ask questions that maybe someone else doesn't ask, and or see something which is really noise as something which is actually beneficial. All right, so let me put up this kind of analogy. So research is beautiful, and it's kind of a little bit like climbing a mountain or walking in the nature. Why do I say this? Because there you have a question, and this can be seen as the peak of the mountain, right, to answer this question and get new knowledge. But often you might think of a way to go there, but while going there, you discover that there are so many paths to actually get to this peak. And often not all of these paths are fruitful, right? But it's really important to keep in mind, and that's why I'm really excited to see this workshop and really supportive for this workshop, that there is also these dead ends, and these dead ends might not be so bad as you might think. In fact, maybe such a dead end can bring you to, in the end, to a new idea, or to what you discover while going to this path and it doesn't lead you anywhere, that you see this other mountain on the other side over the ridge that you didn't know about, and that's maybe your next goal that you can explore. So really think of all these paths that we can explore and do this together in order to advance research, as in this analogy to mountain climbing. And in fact, negative results are something, as Shapnan really nicely introduced, no one wants them. And we might be, frustrated about them. But I would really like to advocate here that they are great. They are actually, if you think about them, really necessary as well, right? Because, we know that on the other, there is this downside that negative results are perceived as something bad, and this is also due to what's called the file drawer problem. A lot of these papers are, insights which are more like negative results are not going to be published, or were not going to be published. So luckily this is changing here, also thanks to this workshop. But there is this huge asymmetry, right? That there's a lot more that doesn't work in contrast to, say, doing a new SOTA on some problem. And so we can think of this as, in fact, this iceberg and the tip of the iceberg. Now, you can think of this as the tip of the iceberg are all these papers that do SOTA and are published. There's a lot of papers that just don't get published. But if you think about this asymmetry as well, it's not just about the number of papers being published on negative versus negative results papers that are not getting published, but it's also typically a lot more effort. So if you think about the effort that goes into one, like a SOTA paper versus a negative result paper, it's very typically also asymmetric, right? There's you need to go. There's a lot more effort that goes into a negative result paper, because you essentially need to prove that something doesn't work, right? As Chapman also hinted at. But now I think this is really, really important, and maybe we shouldn't think so much about like a negative result, but more like an insightful paper, because it doesn't, it really depends on the type of question also we are asking. And so I want to connect back now to the talk by Noah Smith that he gave in the last workshop, and he made this nice conceptual distinction of NLP research. And so he distinguished NLP research from NLP practice. And I want to bring this back because it's in a way, remember, it can remind us what kind of hat did you actually pick when going for doing this part of research, right? So maybe there is actually this kind of two hats that are out there, research versus practice hat. And depending on the hat, and maybe this also helps you to frame your question and see negative results in a completely different light, right? So he put forward this distinction. So here's a reminder. On the one hand, we have NLP researchers, and they are really intrinsically motivated. And the main goal is to answer a question, find out, discover some new knowledge. This is essentially also what like a PhD study is about, creating new knowledge, advancing the field. And then on the other hand, how to measure this success. Well, lots of the time we think about the number of papers and how many people then follow up. And he also talks about citations, which also Bonnie brought up last time. It's much more important, like just like publish everything and let the citations then the impact essentially count. And Noah was even going one step further, so he had citations strike through. I bring them back here because I think they are also important, but they are a way towards, in the end, if you're very, very successful, then you are able to refine a researcher's thinking or improve a researcher's thinking or encourage this researcher to do new things. And that's really, really impactful. And on the other hand, we have NLP practitioners, which are in fact more extrinsically motivated, and it's more about delivering some outcome, maybe a better accuracy, better fairness, or you name it. And there the success can be measured in quite a different way. And I think it's super important to keep in mind that there are these two motivations. And it's also important, as Noah said, it's that we need both, right? We need both the practitioners and the NLP researcher in order to advance the field. I would like to bring these together as a little bit of a yin and yang, right? Because I think even that you can, in your career, sometimes even swap between the two, right? Sometimes you are really after a question, maybe sometimes you are more on improving the accuracy of the tool. Both is fine, and we need both in order to advance the field. And so, but what I want to bring in is another aspect. Besides this distinction, I think serendipity is really, really important, and to also encourage serendipity. So what does this even mean? So here is a quote by Kennedy et al. It's about finding something that is vital to your research, where you didn't know beforehand that you would find it. Yeah, this sounds quite exotic, right? But how can you get to this? I think it's really a concept which helps us to think more creatively about research. And at the same time, we can take this concept of serendipity and try to cultivate it, because I think this can help us to turn failures into opportunities, to essentially, back to this metaphor of the mountain, to explore paths that maybe others wouldn't explore. And so it's about being curious, open-minded, but also persistent and diligent, because it's really, we know this path is going to be more difficult than going to chase sota, right? So, all right, so with this concept of serendipity, I would like to go on and just mention now, okay, you might say, okay, how on earth can I go that far? This sounds very, very ambitious, right? That's right, it is ambitious, but we can also, here are a couple of thoughts or tools to identify research opportunities. And I'm pretty sure most of you already know, but I want to just bring back two sides of identifying research opportunities. Because I think there is really a lot to be done. And we all know this, there is a lot to be done on the NLP research manifold. And so here I want to connect to a recent paper that came out as a findings paper at ACL, talking about the research manifold. So this is a paper by Sebastian, Ivan, and Anas, and they looked essentially at last year's ACL and identified 4 hot areas: multilinguality, fairness and bias, efficiency, and interpretability. And they plotted where, essentially looking at the paper title and abstracts, where most of the papers were concentrated on, finding that there is this square one where a lot of the papers fall into. And in fact, identifying or mentioning that there is a lot of gaps in bridging between these areas, right? There's a lot of people working on multilinguality, quite some people working on fairness, starting to work more people on efficiency, and a lot of more people working on interpretability. But there's a lot of opportunities even to think of, hey, how can we, for instance, make multilingual models fairer or more efficient, right? You can take these dimensions as inspiration for new research areas, even by bridging these dimensions of the manifold. Another way, which I would like to put forward, is that you can, instead of looking at these big pictures, right, big topics, bridging, you can also look at a little bit more what you're doing nowadays. At, say, one of the pipelines, which typically is data modeling innovation, and look at them in a different perspective. And that might open up other opportunities. And this is also what I will try to get back to in the examples afterwards. So try to, see, if you look at this cube here, if you stare at it for 1 second, you might see it differently than if you look at it again. And so this can give you a new perspective of things. So it's actually an ambiguous cube, but this might give you a new perspective as well. So I hope that gave you a little bit of a motivation for your future research. And now in this next part, I want to come to 3 concrete research examples that we've been doing in order to make some of these kind of meta concepts a little bit more tangible, hopefully, and give you a set of examples of, how can we actually make some failure somehow insightful or useful. And in the rest of the talk, I will give you these 3 examples. On the first is on essentially falling under this umbrella of trying to make metadata count, right? So we focus a lot on labeled data alone, but often we have metadata. Hey, can we actually use metadata as well? The second part is going to talk about human label divergences or human disagreement. And this is going to be a larger part of the talk, because also afterwards we will have a panel on this in the afternoon. And the last part is going to show you a recent study that we've been doing on looking at the BERT detail and some open questions. So some surprising result on one of these BERT details. Right. All right, and so these are the corresponding research questions that we're trying to look at in these 3 parts. So let me dive into the first one. And that's about how useful is the fortuitous metadata, and in this case, for low resource parsing. So now here we look at universal dependencies. We're interested in multilingual dependency parsing. And it's a beautiful resource that has been created over the last 8 years, roughly 7-8 years. And here we see an overview of how many languages are covered today. But most of you probably know this already, but what is perhaps less known is that each of the 3 banks is essentially coming with a set of metadata tags. And these metadata tags, or genre tags, which we will call them in the rest of the talk, are essentially labels at the tree bank, which here is what the authors write about them. Okay, so the tree banks are heterogeneous with respect to the type of the text, or spoken data even to some degree. And these meta tags are like a very coarse-grained picture of this variation. And so it is like the different genres that are reported. So each tree bank provider provides this metadata. And what is interesting to note here is that these genre categories are neither mutually exclusive nor based on homogeneous criteria, but it's currently the best documentation that can be obtained to quantify these different types of text in UD. Okay? So you notice here already, this sounds like kind of a little bit of, I mean, I don't really want to call it, but I call it now a failure, okay? Because they are quite, yeah. But the question is now, is this something that we can use? And I think this is super interesting to explore and hasn't been explored very much. And so we call it here, or they also call it genre labels. And just to note that this is actually a quite, it's very difficult to get a clear definition of genre. Domain or register are other terms that are used in the community, also different communities. But in this work, we take a very pragmatic definition of genre, and in fact take these 18 community-provided categories in UD as genre definitions. So what are they? Here we are essentially plotting these genre tags in UD. And it's actually quite difficult to estimate the number of amount of data that falls into each of these genre labels, because we don't have for each sentence or tree a label that it belongs to this label or multiple labels. So we here just plot the cumulative sizes as the upper bounds, and just counting single genre tree banks as the lower bound to give us a picture about the distribution. What we can see here is that a lot of the information falls into newswire, right? And there is this long tail of, like, if you look at the poetry or medical tree banks, emails, there is a lot less in the tree bank. In fact, we also see that some of these are not so clearly distinguishable, right? So if you think about web and wiki, for instance, right? Or social is also a very interesting category. But here we take these labels because we are interested in cross-lingual transfer. So typically in cross-lingual transfer, we're interested in, okay, let's take an English, say an English model, and we're trying to adapt it to, say, Danish, are the red dots here now. Well, let's take Faroese, essentially, much more lower resource language even. And what happens if you think back now and do this experiment in UD is typically we are actually doing English newswire to Faroese newswire adaptation, right? But ideally, would like a model that also works well on Faroese lyrics or poets or literature and other types of genres, reviews or whatever. And this is what we're trying to target. So essentially, how can we make a model that's better for specific genre in a language for which we don't have any annotated data? And this is a paper by one of my brilliant PhD students, Max Müller-Eberstein and Rob van der Groot, on what we published last year in NLP. So the key idea is, in fact, hey, can we turn these genre labels into some fortuitous data, and does this help us to improve multilingual dependency parsing or low resource dependency parsing? So that's the first question. To what extent does it aid better parsing? Or in fact, what we're doing here is better selection of data from the UD in order to parse the new target. But we also asked the question, how much is genre inherently captured into these multilingual language models? And so the setup is as follows. We assume we want to parse, for instance, Faroese literature. Say these are these red dots. And we have all of our UD here at disposal, where the boxes are tree banks and each of the dots are sentences in the tree bank. Essentially, it boils down to trying to find, to hypothesize that trying to find these dots, which are also red, close to the target, are going to be the useful training items. And we want to select those in order to train the parser to improve on the target data. And why that? Because we know if we train on all of the UD and all of the languages, all of the genres together, that's on the one hand leading to a very huge and expensive model to train. But on the other hand, we also know that this is working suboptimally. The problem is that we do not have these colors on the instance level. We only have labels at the tree bank level, but not at the instance level. So how can we do targeted data selection with this problem? So we have, again, the tree banks. We do not have the information on the sentence level, but we do have this meta label, genre labels at the tree bank level. So what we propose in this work is to use those in order to select data from the tree banks. And we devised, in fact, we test 5 ways in order to do so. One is encoding the sentences and selecting the closest sentences in multilingual embedded space. The second is by relying on, okay, look, you're now passing red dots, means say literature, then you select all tree banks which contain literature and use that. This is kind of what a practitioner would do. But we go further and on the one hand, try to build a classifier that bootstraps itself from the genre labels. So if you have a single genre tree banks and mixed tree banks, we are able to resolve tree banks for which we don't have single genre tree banks in 3 steps, build a classifier that essentially predicts the genre label for each instance, and that we call bootstrapping classifier. And then finally, we also look at, in fact, at the clustering approach, because in the bootstrapping method, we are essentially, or also in the other method, like sentence selection, we remove the tree bank boundaries. But now here, we essentially cluster first by tree bank and then try to find, okay, we cluster by tree bank, the amount of clusters in the tree. And then we are trying to find the closest centroids within those clusters and select instances according to this. All right. So how about the results? We tested this approach on 12 low resource languages. Within UD, they come from very different language families and also cover, they are between 200 and 2000 instances in size. They cover a variety of genres, and note that we restrict ourselves here to passing single genre tree banks. And we see that, for instance, we have Faroese Wikidata, Telugu grammars, or Cantonese spoken data, for instance. And so the setup is as follows: taking these 12 targets, we want to essentially find select this target proxy data to train our parser. And then in order to pass the target, and we have data for the target, measure labeled attachment score in order to see how good the approach is. Right, so here are the results. Notice, so target is actually an upper bound where we take a similar or a family language, a tree bank from the language or from another language, from within the language, sorry, to pass the data. And we see already that from this upper bound, it's a very challenging problem where we an average see a LLS score of 50. Now, how far can we get to this 50% LES? Now, what we saw is if we do take the practitioner's approach, which selects the target data based on the tree bank labels and just takes the whole tree bank, we are around 34% LES. And now the question is, how good is random selection or sentence-based selection? We actually noticed that by selecting these sentences, we can outperform the model, which is trained on 8 times the data. So Meta is really trained on 8 times the amount of these sets here. And so less data is more beneficial, but we also see that on average, random is very similar to just selecting, the mean pooled, the closest sentence representation in multilingual BERT space. And now you need, this is really, it depends on the language. Sometimes it helps, but on average, they are very, very close. So we need another signal in order to improve upon that. And what we see in this work is, in fact, that we can use genre in order to improve upon this 36% LES on average. Our bootstrapping approach, which is built on the classifier, gives us around 47%. And both of these cluster-based approaches give us an LES of 38. So we could really improve upon this, say, taking the meta approach to improve the low resource dependency parsing, where we find, for instance, that for ferries, we started off with 60-ish, which was essentially better than even the in-language or closed language baseline, but up to 68%. So some of these results are very, very promising to help perhaps even a researcher to build a new tree bank in a new language for which there isn't any data yet out there. The second part is, in fact, how much is genre captured in this multilingual and language models. And we see here a plot of a Disney's plot on just labeling sentences by the genre information. We see that multilingual BERT out of the box essentially already clusters some of these genres quite nicely. And if we do our bootstrapping-based classifier, we essentially can amplify this information, which helps selecting better training data for low resource parsing. So takeaways from this part is that genre is a valuable signal for parsing answers in low resource languages. And we also saw that genre is inherently captured in multilingual language models, and amplifying it helps to improve parsing performance. And we also have a follow-up study. If you're interested in this line of work, I really encourage you to talk to Maxis at the ACL. And also there's a paper on looking more into this genre distinction in UD, which I can recommend to check out. All right. So far, I gave you an example of using genre for parsing, cross-lingual parsing. Now let's look into another huge area, and that's human disagreement and labeling. And the question is, essentially, is this noise or is it signal that we can exploit? And so now here is an example that you might have seen. How many sticks are there? And we know that we might get very different answers, right? Plausible answers. And all of us essentially know that disagreement in annotation is everywhere. If you have done an annotation project, you notice that there's a lot of disagreement and subtleties in annotation. But here I want to take this stance of looking at it as maybe there is benefit to it, right? Maybe this is some other source of what I call fortuitous data, that by looking at this disagreement from another perspective, hey, actually, maybe we can leverage it in order to even improve our automatic understanding of language in NLP. I want to highlight now one little thing about naming. Let me call it still here human disagreement in this part of the talk. I want to return to this name in the end. But what I do assume is it's not just plain noise, but there is some implicit, genuine disagreement in there. And we'll give you a couple of examples for that. So let's look, in fact, at a couple of data points. So here is an example of recognizing textual entailment, or what's nowadays typically referred to as natural language understanding, where the task is we have a premise, so like Amanda carried the package from home, and the hypothesis, Amanda moved. And the question is, does the premise entail the hypothesis? If you now look at the original RTE data, which I think was released in 2008, then the original label in that data set is the adverse entailment relation. If you look at this example, maybe, did Amanda move? Question mark, right? So Eli Pavlik and Tom Krakowski in 2019, what they did is take a subset of the original RTE data and let it re-annotate. So let 50 crowdsourced workers re-annotate these sentences, and what they observed then, by actually asking them on a scale whether there is an entailment in this relation, you see that the majority of the annotators son and tailment relation, but there is also, another peak here, right? Or even a little peak on the opposite, so that there's even a contradiction here. And there is new work in this direction as well, like chaos NLI, that came out in 2020, that again re-annotates NLI data with up to 100 annotators in their case. But now we can even go to more, more presumably objective part-of-speech, like part-of-speech tagging tasks, right? And there are even linguistically hard cases even for post tagging. So there's a nice reference also to Manning in 2011 about this problem, that there's genuine difficult cases where it's hard to come up with a correct label. And here's an example, like say anything with boyfriend. What is this anything essentially? It can be a noun, but it can also be an adverb here, right? So there is this genuine ambiguity even in cases which are presumably more objective. Another example is the task of understanding direct questions. So if you have a polar question, hey, everything okay? We humans are very good in not directly answering yes or no, but we give like an answer like, I'm just mad at my agent. So an indirect answer to the question. And so also there, it was observed that there's a lot of disagreement between, wait, what does this mean? Is this a yes, is this a no? And so on and so forth. And we'll return to this task a little bit later. And if you look at the literature, I'm just plotting here a couple of examples. There is really a huge literature on this, in where you see people discussing disagreement in, for instance, relation extraction. There's a lot of work by Laura and Chris Welty, but now more and more even on more subjective language, right? So like abusive and offensive language. When is a label, a sentence hateful or not hateful, right? There is all sorts of other things that play into this. But if you go back to more objective tasks, and like even in dependency parsing, this has been pointed out, and more recently also in visual question answering, we do see that annotators give plausible alternatives. And here is an example from Jolly et al., where we see that what's the pattern of the little girl's dress? Okay, it's a plate, and it's a lot of quite high agreement here, like 4, and the rest is quite similar answers. But here, where it's on a road, which is the ground truth, where it's outdoors, right? There is, or Sweden even, there can be quite different answers, which could potentially be plausible. But the models are still trained on the ground truth, on the single preferred most frequent item, essentially. So is this disagreement actually randomly distributed? So in order to understand whether we can use it, we need to understand whether there is some systematicity to it. And here is some work that we have been doing quite some time ago. And we were interested in essentially annotating part-of-speech tagging from data and looking at whether these disagreements are to some degree systematic and whether we can estimate them from small samples of doubly annotated data. And here are the results. So we see here a sample of a confusion matrix between these 12 part-of-speech tags on a sample from Newswire and Twitter data. And if you look at these plots, there are some cases, there are some regularities where we see that, for instance, adjective noun are confusions which are quite prominent in both types of data. But there is, of course, also some specific confusions to like more the Twitter data, but there is some systematicity. It doesn't look like just plain randomness. So no, this is something we could observe, and others as well. And we can also use small samples of doubly annotated data to in fact estimate these. But another interesting related question is, hey, how are these disagreement unimodal? And there's this nice work, in fact, by Ellie and Tom, and they ask, in fact, is there just one mode essentially, or is there inherent disagreements? Because if we had like one mode or a unimodal distribution, then we would in fact assume that there is a single ground truth, which in the in the long term, what we are doing is the correct way to do, that we have just one ground truth and we model it as we used to do it. So what they did is, in fact, they did this re-annotation of the RT or NLI data. And here are two examples. For instance, Paula swatted a fly. Swatting happened in a forceful manner. And these are, they essentially collect this annotated, re-annotated data, 50 annotators per instance, and then you can plot this distribution where they then fitted a Gaussian mixture model and saw that effect in quite some cases. You see in the next slide, a bimodal distribution was a better fit to the data than the typical unimodal distribution that we assume. I think this is very interesting take, in fact, because they showed that this is not just unimodal data that we observe, meaning that there is genuine disagreement in this data. In fact, they also looked at in how many of these examples, so they had close to 500 sentence pairs, and in roughly around 20% of these sentence pairs, there was a non-trivial second component. So you see here the number of instances and the number of components that explain that variation. So it's really, really nice work. So we can say, are disagreement distributions unimodal? No. And do they contain inherent disagreement signal? Yes, they do. So we know now that, in fact, it's disagreement in human labeling is signal, right? There is something to be gained from that. And I was very happy actually also to see Svapna's talk at the ACL this year, because she mentioned another interesting case where, from the data maps they plotted, training on the ambiguous cases, which are the difficult cases, essentially helped out of distribution generalization, right? This is another evidence that disagreement is actually helpful for, in this case, out of distribution generalization. With my PhD student, Mike Zhang, we also looked at essentially trying to explore the, let me just put here, this space here between the hard to learn and ambiguous instances in order to try to come up with a better acquisition function or active learning. And so there's yet another piece of evidence that these cases where there is no such clear cut are useful. There's very nice work also by Leonardelli et al. From last year's NLP. So they looked at hate speech detection, and they did systematic studies on the quality of agreement. So they have like high agreement, mid agreement, low agreement cases, and then compared training on those versus just randomly selecting. And they saw that, that was much lower. So there is signal to this disagreement cases all over the board. Now the question is, how can we actually leverage disagreement? I gave you some pointers, but I want to come up with some more systematic way of categorizing how to leverage disagreement, because this is a large literature which is more and more emerging. And so we can essentially, if you think back, there are two big ways on how to go about it. One is to resolve it, and the other one is to, in fact, embrace it. And so the two big areas are resolving it by aggregating or filtering, or embracing it by trying to model it, and model it in two different ways. And we'll get into each of those four in the next part. So the typical way is to aggregate disagreement, right? So to come up with this single ground truth, and that's what we are taking. And there is a lot of literature on different ways of aggregating. Often we still take the majority vote, but then we're training our model on the aggregated label. So that's the standard. But this is widely adopted, neglecting that there are these genuine human nuances. An alternative, and that's advocated by some part of the literature, is instead, hey, we do not want these cases of disagreement. We want higher agreement. So we want to actually filter out these cases which are of low, presumably low quality. And so it's training on aggregated labels, but also filtered instances. So essentially, this is again a way to neglect disagreement, but it's also, I think, a waste of data to throw these instances away, because there's a lot of effort that goes into labeling typically. Now, the alternative is to try to embrace disagreement. And here we can see two ways to go about it. One is to learn from unintegrated labels. Okay, we could technically take each of the annotations as a label and learn directly from them before not even aggregating them. And so this would ultimately really embrace all nuances that we see, right? And there is a lot of literature on that. There's methods of varying complexity on how to do this. So you could take a multi-layer label perspective, but there's also methods which are very, they differ whether they are generally applicable, like Zhang et al.'s repeated labeling approach, to more architecture specific, where you need to change the loss function of the architecture to make it work. But we have seen so far that for NLP, they are essentially of varying success. If we compare them to Alexandra Uma did a very nice comparison with Tommaso to compare them and see that they are more promising currently for tasks in the computer vision literature, but I think there is much more to be done still here in this space. And the fourth approach is to enrich the gold with disagreement labels. So essentially taking a little bit the best of both worlds. So where we still assume there's a gold, but also try to embrace the disagreement and the raw annotations, or the distribution of the raw annotations, in order to learn from the aggregated plus some sort of soft labels. Sorry, I forgot to add it. So this embraces these nuances besides the gold, and we could see it as a sort of regularization effect. I'm seeing I'm going, we start a little bit later, so I hope it's okay to go to 10:05-ish. Please shout if not. So I just plot quickly two ways to essentially augment the gold. One is you could weigh the loss by disagreement. So this is a way of taking this confusion matrix that we've seen before and essentially update less on items for which the annotators disagree on, and see it as a sort of cost-sensitive learning. The advantage of this method is that it only needs a small sample of doubly annotated data to get the confusion matrix. But I want to also point at a limitation, because it's of limited expressivity and might not be so super fruitful in all of the cases. Instead, another approach is to use soft labels. And here the idea is to take try to learn the output of the model so that it's closer to the annotated distribution, instead of just the argmax. And there's many different ways on how you can do so, but you could use, for instance, the KL divergence between these two distributions as a soft loss. And this is, in fact, the approach we proposed in 2021 with Tommaso and Alessandra, and also Massimo, on instead of using just a gold label for training, we enrich the model with an auxiliary task that also learns to get closer to the annotated distribution. So this is an approach that has the benefit that it needs only one auxiliary head. There's other multitask learning approaches which model each annotator separately, and here you model essentially distribution of the instances. And it actually, we saw that this has very good results across very different tasks. So it's a very promising direction. And finally, we can also think about learning from unintegrated labels with, for instance, a method which is called deep learning from crowds, where in fact, you can see this is kind of a multitask approach, where each annotator gets its own output head, and you're trying to add that on top. And then in the end, we remove this deep crowd layer for prediction. And here I just want to point briefly to a study that we've been doing with my former thesis students, and we have annotated a new data set of for understanding indirect answers to questions. And what we saw here is that we observed that when we train a model with without the crowd rule layer, we observed it's actually one of, maybe I should start by saying it's a very difficult task. So the accuracy and F1 scores are very low. It's also a skewed distribution that we have here. And we are modeling here the first 4 labels, ignoring these 2. And what we see is that the crowd layer can actually help us improve the F1 score, but it didn't improve accuracy. And this is due to hurting a little bit on the majority label. But it is in helping us to also model the annotators so that we can see that, for instance, annotator 2 is giving more, less agreeing with the gold standard on label 3, which was this conditional one, and more giving it a clear-cut perspective. So I think this is very interesting, but notice that we in fact still compare to F1 score or accuracy. But what we can do here is that since we have also the annotations for all of the test cases, we can look at, hey, how many of the test cases do we get incorrect predictions, and how does this relate to human disagreement? And what we observe here is that on cases where all the annotators agree, there are fewer incorrect predictions, but on cases where there is a disagreement, with at least one annotator, then we see that the models also make more errors. So we really need to think about ways in order to integrate that into modeling. And we just showed here one way to do so. In fact, human disagreement impacts all stages of the NLP pipeline, data modeling and evaluation. And I just want to briefly mention also that we need to really talk about also evaluation in this sphere, because a lot will go a little bit far quicker now, because many works on learning from disagreement, including our own, compare still against an evaluation set where we assume we have a single ground truth. And this is clearly a downside, right? We want to model annotator nuances, but then we still evaluate it against just a single ground truth. We need to do better here, because these sources of the disagreement can be plentiful. We also need to understand them better. Are they due to ambiguity alone, test difficulty, social demographic differences, which play a huge role in hate speech and other more subjective tasks, and so on and so forth. And so we advocate here to not just look at evaluation against the gold standard, or what we call a hard evaluation, but also think about ways to embrace these soft labels into evaluation and how to get better estimations on that. I will come back to this slide a little bit later as well, because I want to put forward 4 ways in order to move forward. So I think it's very important that we get more data and release more annotator label data sets with annotator level labels. This is something I've, shameless plug, been advocating for a long time, and I'm very happy to see more people now advocating for this and more data sets being released. So this is great. So please continue doing so. The second one is, in fact, back to evaluation. We need better evaluation. There is work in this sphere. So for instance, measuring F1 against individuals was done by Davani et al. For hate speech recently. There is also the idea of, hey, to cluster users, or there is a whole what's called disagreement deconvolution idea, which is somewhere in the middle of clustering and individual predictions. So the proposal is to compare to each annotator's belief, while also looking at, they can make, there are these attention slips throughout annotation. So there is also a component of trying to model what is the primary label this annotator would give. So it's a very interesting direction. And another third way forward is to think of human disagreement and what correlations with model uncertainty. We see, for instance, that there is some recent work emerging that modeling these perspectives can help us to do better correlation model correlation of uncertainty with disagreement, of course, right? Luckily, we see that, otherwise it would be a bit surprising. But I would also want to put forward here a little detour on the naming that I initially put forward. We see that this concept is named in very different ways in different communities. So I call it now human disagreement, which implicitly assumes conflicting cases. But it doesn't need to be conflicting. It could be really, due to biases, but what kind of biases is not really well defined. Or some people also advocate for data perspectives or opinions, but that in effect drags it towards more subjective difference. And some of these differences might not be subjective. So I would like to would like to put forward that we can maybe think of it as human level variation, and we would need to measure, understand, and come up with better ways in order to embrace human level variation in all of our parts of the pipeline. Because there is, I think this is really a continuum and not just noise versus error. And the question is, what level is, how can we actually get to acceptable variation level variation? I think this is a huge site, acceptable variation, but still there's also noise, and we need to also detect these differences. All right, so take-home message from this part is that I wanted to show you that not all human level variation, what I call it now, is noise. We should embrace it during learning, but we need definitely much more work in that direction. We also need to embrace it during evaluation, we need better evaluation methods, and also to identify what are best ways to go about it, what are best ways to evaluate in light of this. All right, I will skip over this slide because I have a very last concept which I wanted to talk about. What we started like 10 past. I'm not sure if I can still show this. Watching now to my organizers, or should I just stop here? How much time do I still get?
Barbara, we have time for maybe 5 or 10 minutes more.
Oh, perfect. 5 minutes is enough. Great. Then I still can cover that aspect. I hope you find it interesting. So very recently we were looking at BERT model, right, and reproducing some other work. And while doing so, we found out that there is a detail which is perhaps less studied, and we were a little bit puzzled by the results. So I want to share this puzzle. The question is, how impactful are segment embeddings for low resource NLP? So this is a work that comes up at LRAC, and this together again with Rob van der Groot and Max Müller-Everstein. And so we were interested in the segment embeddings. And now if I were there, I would like to ask you to raise your hand if you knew about segment embeddings. Unfortunately, I can't see you, so maybe some other person can tell me afterwards how many people. Please raise your hand. Do you know about segment embeddings? Someone can tell me later how much.
We have 2.
Oh, two hands up. Oh, wow. Okay, that's okay. That's surprising, right? Because it looks like these segments is kind of an understudied BERT detail. So what are they? Segment embeddings are essentially encodings of, it's just a matrix of 2 times the embedding size, and they just encode what the segment the sentence is on, right? So this is, for instance, if you have, what time is it? Summertime. It's the first segment is encoded by 0s, and the second segment is encoded by 1s. So it's kind of the sentence IDs. And there are, besides word piece embeddings or word subword embeddings and position embeddings, which a lot of people studied, are like the third ingredient in the BERT model that is going to be added together as a representation and then fed into the transformer layer. So in fact, why are they there? They are there because in the original model, the model was trained on next sentence prediction task, right? So the first sentence set the second sentence and then this auxiliary task. But they are also there for, paired input tasks. You typically would put the question on the first segment and the answer on the second segment, and then use the CLS token to classify whether the question answer pair. So we were interested in, okay, hey, what, for tasks which do not have pairs, does it matter whether you put them on the first or the second segment? That's the question. And what we saw is we tried to, in fact, do this on token level tasks and also compared to paired sentence tasks. And we tried to do a couple of variations. So this would be the original, right? The first and the second segment. We try to just put it all to one, or you could average the two embeddings that you get. You can set them all to 0 to kind of disable them, set them to random values, or set them all to zeros. And what we noticed is, I jump quickly to the results here because I want to share the most interesting result. Essentially for token level tasks, dependency parsing, post tagging, morphological tagging, we saw on 9 tree banks, we tested this on over 5 runs, that there is essentially large differences when using the very popular multilingual BERT case model. And so here, what you see is, if you use, on average over these 9 low resource languages, the original setup where you put it on 0, you get that average LAS score. If you just swap it towards 1, you can get a huge boost. You can get up to 2.5% LS improvement by just swapping these segments. And this was essentially the surprising finding, but what's also surprising is we tested the multilingual uncased version, which is available. But if you look at the website, it says, okay, this is the difference is that it's uncased. And otherwise, please don't use it. There's a recommendation even to not use that model. And interestingly, we observed that in that model, we can't see this effect. And plus, on average, it's even better than the widely used multilingual model. So the uncased model that's not recommended to use was better in these low resource setups. And there are details in the paper because, of course, there's variation across these 9 languages, but these are the average results that show that there is a big gap, and particularly this gap for low resource languages on token level tasks. It really matters. And so, unfortunately, we don't know more about why is there even this big gap between multilingual BERT cased and uncased, right? So a lot of this, why is it even not recommended? Yeah, we don't know. Why are this difference there? So there's a lot more to be discovered. So takeaway here is we observed that swapping the segment embeddings might impact low resource NLP tasks, especially as token level tasks. Please note one caveat of this is when we have a lot of data, we don't see this effect anymore. So it's really on training on low resource, small data sets that we see this effect. And we didn't see this effect so much on paired sentence tasks. So it's really when putting these single sentence tasks onto which embedding in low resource setup that this was a huge impact. So this is, I think it's an interesting negative result, but unfortunately we can't completely understand why this is the case. We hypothesized that it might have to do that the multilingual model is trained on the next sentence prediction task is essentially trained on sampling different languages. So maybe it's related to that, but we would need more experiments in this. And we would need also more details on how these pre-trained language models are actually exactly trained. What is exactly the data? What's exact training setup? Are the next sentence prediction sentences all from different languages, and we are essentially learning also to distinguish the sentences, or are we really just learning about whether this sentence follows the other one and so on. So this brings me to the end. To sum up, I wanted to show you 3 examples of what I would see like more negative results, and try to turn them into something more positive. So we saw genre tags are not perfect, but we can make a data count. I think there is more to be done in this direction. We also saw human disagreement in labeling, presumably is noise, but we can essentially make this human label variation as well profitable to use, but we need more work in this direction. And we saw BERT, that BERT contains these segment embeddings, and do they matter? And we can see that we need also more work in making sense of understudied details in these models. And with this, I would like to thank you so much for the invitation and for giving this talk. I'm really grateful to all students, lab members, and collaborators for the work, and also for the research funders. And finally, I hope this inspired some of you to go into some, off the beaten track direction, to explore a little bit more, because maybe I want to end with this slide. I really love this quote by Barbara Gross from ACL this year, and hopefully this talk inspired you a little bit. I would be very happy to see that outcome, even though I'm sorry for my voice and maybe not perfect presentation today. So thanks a lot for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Unfortunately, we have maybe time for 1 or 2 very short questions, because we need to start the next session.
Yeah, there's one in the one hand up.
Hello, Barbara.
Hi.
My name is Steve Thomas. I'm from Queen's University in Canada. Thank you for the great talk. And I was especially interested in the human disagreement element. This is only something I've recently learned about, and it's very interesting. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how to detect genuine noise, maybe just an error, as opposed to a hard instance where there is room for legitimate disagreement.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is a great question. There is some work on trying to tease apart and find, mine for annotation errors, for instance. But there's no solution to this that I could point you to now. I think we really need to go in this work direction much more, because I think there's a lot of value into, as you saw, value into leveraging this disagreement. But we need to assume that there is, not everything is just errors, because if it's just errors, we can't get the signal. But I think it's also a small proportion which are really errors, if you do it well in data collection. So an alternative is to, instead of detecting it afterwards, you could think about ways to improve your data collection. And for instance, the chaos NLI work put a lot of effort into training the annotators sufficiently enough and putting checkpoints in, so that you get to some assumed, that you get to a level where you can't even assume there is almost no noise in it, and so you can actually skip that. But it's an important question, and we need more research.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Barbara. It's Bonnie here. I'm glad you quoted the Begman-Klubanov article. They actually have a series of 3 articles. And one of the problems with training is, one of the observations they made was that an annotator can put in an annotation and 2 months later annotate the same examples again in a different way. So it's not that training is the answer to everything, that individuals can be thinking about different things when they're doing the annotations. So I think we're stuck with some of this. You talked about different ways of getting around it, but you're clearly identifying both the problem that there is inconsistent annotation, and we need to do something about it, but it's not clear what we can do. So thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. In fact, thanks a lot also for your inspiration on this, on many works, also on the genre, essentially. But you're right. I browsed over this slide where I had these sources of disagreement. It's not just, in fact, task difficulty or ambiguity or which is something that we can do by training, but there is also the in-person variation that is something we cannot avoid, right? Even if we redo annotations, we might not give the same label at a later point in time. But that perhaps points at, again, interesting questions about what does this label even mean, or these sets of labels, or how do the labels relate to each other, which I think are very important questions to pose instead of, we often think of these, categories which are independent of each other, and we also model them in such a way. But there is a lot of these dependencies, nuances between sets of labels, where we can think of better ways of even handling them, as we are doing today, thinking of maybe hierarchical approaches. There is work in this direction again, but I think there are interesting questions by looking at this. And one maybe note on that, this work that I briefly mentioned about the disagreement deconvolution, what they do is interesting take on that problem of, okay, people might over time annotate, give us conflicting labels. They try to solve it or advocate for, okay, each annotator has presumably a primary label that he or she would give, and we would need a model that for the annotator first find the primary label before we look across annotators. I think that's another interesting idea that we can think more about in future.
Let's thank the speaker once more time.